The French Revolution. Part 2, The Revolution continues. Like changes in a river with the passage of time, the Revolution changed in nature from 1791 to 1799. In 1791, the National Assembly was writing a constitution to reform the French government. It was hoped that differences could be resolved peacefully. Some changes were not popular. When monasticism and the nobility were abolished, members of these special interest groups were unhappy at the loss of their privileged positions. Much of the land belonging to the church was taken away by the government to be sold to raise money. Paper assignats, or promissory notes, were printed to cover immediate needs for money. These notes promised that the government would pay back the money when it sold the church's land. Eventually, the assignats were used for money, but inflation made people lose confidence in them. When the government made the French clergy employees of the state, the Pope denounced the revolution because it eliminated papal authority over the church in France. Reforms, such as the division of France into 83 departments, fairly equal in size, were accepted peacefully. This created political units small enough to allow the people to travel to their capital in one day to take care of business. Nobility feared the growing violence within the country, and many fled France. They were called émigrés, or emigrants. Some crossed the northeastern border and began to organize resistance against the revolution, a counter-revolution. They wanted King Louis XVI to regain the power he had enjoyed during the Ancien Régime, or Old Regime. On June 20th, 1791, in a daring escape, the king and his family fled northeast from Paris in an attempt to join the army of émigrés. Here in the city of Varennes, Louis XVI was recognized. His coach was stopped and the royal family arrested. An alert employee of the post office at Saint-Ménehould recognized the royal family and alerted the people of the town. Louis was returned to Paris, and it was clear that he was not to be trusted. The king appeared willing to do anything to overthrow the revolution, even if it led to civil war. Fiery speeches in the streets helped to spread pro-revolutionary propaganda. Newspapers and pamphlets also inflamed people's passions against the king. Publications by Camille Desmoulins and Jean-Paul Marat were sold here under the arches of the Palais Royal. The Café Procope, founded in 1686, was the scene of lively political discussions during revolutionary times. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press were accorded the French through the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Even though Louis XVI had tried to flee the country, the National Assembly agreed to let him remain as king if he accepted the new Constitution of 1791 that had taken 2 years to create. He swore an oath of loyalty to accept it, and thus became part of the new government, the Legislative Assembly. This was a constitutional monarchy. There was still a king, but his power was limited by the Constitution, and certain rights were guaranteed to the people. To show his sympathy with the people, Louis wore a bonnet rouge, or red hat, the liberty cap of the Revolution. The conservatives, who sat on the right side of the Assembly Hall, favored letting the king stay. The radicals, who sat on the left side, wanted to get rid of the king. The moderates, who sat in the center, had varying opinions. The seating arrangement in the time of the French Revolution has come to describe those of different political viewpoints in modern times: left radical, center moderate, and right conservative. In the spring of 1792, war was declared on Austria and Prussia by the Legislative Assembly. These two countries, east of France, wanted to overthrow the revolution and restore the monarchy. The French army, however, was not prepared for war, and it became evident that France could easily be invaded. The country was declared to be in danger, and the French people rushed to her aid, enlisting in the army, telling their loved ones goodbye. In Strasbourg, musical composer Rouget de Lisle was inspired by the songs which expressed people's determination to defend the revolution. He wrote the Marseillaise, originally known as the war song of the Army of the Rhine. Army enlistees from Marseille sang this haunting song on their march to Paris. Here on the Arc de Triomphe today can be seen the famous march into the city. This is commonly known as the Marseillaise. What did Louis XVI think about the growing revolutionary army? Would he ask the Austrians for help to overthrow the government? Since Austrian Emperor Francis II was Marie Antoinette's nephew, there was certainly cause for suspicion. On August 10th, 1792, the people could no longer control their distrust of the king and queen. The strong iron gates of the Tuileries Palace could not hold back the unruly Republican mob. Rioters attacked the palace, massacring the Swiss Guard and many nobles. But the royal family had already found refuge in the Legislative Assembly nearby. At this location in the Tuileries Garden, the Legislative Assembly abolished the monarchy and called for a national convention to write a new constitution. This time, there was no longer a place for a king under any terms. France was declared a republic. The royal family was imprisoned in the temple dungeon to await its fate, which was to be decided by the convention. Just before the convention was to meet, a new threat to France took place many miles to the east of Paris. Prussians crossed the border and were invading France. They pushed all the way to this windmill at Valmy before the French could stop them. The Prussian invasion caused fear and suspicion within the country and resulted in the September massacres of over 1,000 people in Parisian prisons. Many were thought to have been guilty of aiding the enemy. The battlefield was not the only place of fighting. Within the convention itself, two sides fought for power, the Montagnards and the Girondins. The Montagnards were led by the radicals Maximilien de Robespierre and Georges Danton. These Montagnards, or radicals, sat in the seats highest up in the convention, on the mountain, and wanted a strong, united government with power to handle emergency situations. Danton, like Robespierre, often stirred up people's passions. In the years to come, they would become the most violent faction. The Jacobin Club was one political group which supported radical philosophy. It was called that because the club met in an old Jacobin monastery. The club appealed especially to the urban poor, the sans-culottes of Paris and other artisans and shopkeepers. Sans-culottes, or those who wore long pants, was the name given to the lower classes by the aristocrats, who wore the culotte pants, which reached only to the knees. Eventually, the word sans-culotte, or a man without the culotte, came to be associated with one of revolutionary political ideas. He also wore the bonnet rouge, or red hat, which was the liberty cap of the revolution. It appeared everywhere as a popular motif, even on wallpaper and china. Much of the success of the revolution was due to pro-revolutionary propaganda in many aspects of daily life. The Girondin faction of the convention was led by Pierre Vergniaud and Jacques Brissot. They came from Bordeaux near the Gironde estuary and so were known as Girondins. They did not want the convention dominated solely by the people of Paris, but wanted those from other parts of France to have some say in how things were to be decided. The future of Louis XVI caused one of the disputes between the two groups. The king was accused of corresponding with the enemy, but what should they do about it? The Girondins merely wanted to imprison him, but the Montagnards voted for his execution. The delegates read him the results of the vote. Unfortunately for Louis, the Montagnards won. Thus, on January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI said farewell to his family before being taken to the guillotine for his execution. As the heavy blade severed the head of the King of France from his body, it also divided the monarchy of the past from the republic of the future. The reign of terror was about to begin. The guillotine was developed by Dr. Joseph Guillotin, who hoped that France could achieve equality for all, even in its method of execution. Death by guillotine was quick and relatively painless, especially when compared to some of the tortures of the time. The French Republic began to export revolutionary ideas to the Rhineland and to Belgium after conquering those countries in war. Other European monarchs were alarmed. By the summer of 1793, Britain and Spain joined Austria and Prussia in war against France, hoping to stop the revolutionary cancer from spreading. Another problem for the convention was the armed rebellion by people from other parts of France, such as the region of the Vendée in the west. The people of this royalist stronghold fought from 1793 to 1796 to overthrow the Republic. When caught by Republican authorities, punishment was severe. After one battle in 1793, royalist survivors and their families were taken to Nantes and drowned in the Loire. Though order was restored by the Convention's Committee of Public Safety, an atmosphere of crisis prevailed that led into the Reign of Terror in 1794. People from surveillance committees watched everyone to report those who might be enemies of the Republic. Thousands of people all over France were held for a year or longer without a trial. The Revolutionary Tribunal of Paris was one of 30 courts which tried prisoners for crimes against the Republic and ordered executions. Marie Antoinette was among those sentenced to death in France during the Terror. For more than 2 months, she awaited her fate in a simple room, here in the Conciergerie before facing the guillotine. In the women's courtyard, stained glass windows marked the cell where the former queen was held captive. The condemned left the Conciergerie through a small door leading to the Rue de Paris to meet Monsieur de Paris, the high executioner. Carts carried the victims to the guillotine on the Place de la Révolution, where they faced their death before a jeering crowd. Some women would even knit while they watched. Though women participated more in political activity during the Revolution, they did not have equality with men, and they weren't allowed to vote. Today's Place de la Concorde marks the spot where so many heads fell during the Reign of Terror. The name was changed from the Place de la Révolution in hopes that it might help erase the memory of violence and suffering that had taken place there. An Egyptian obelisk stands tall here, as did the guillotine in revolutionary times. The extremist Robespierre relied on the guillotine in an attempt to do away with all corrupt and aristocratic elements in society. Political leader and journalist Jean-Paul Marat believed in violent solutions to any political problem. As editor of the newspaper L'Ami du Peuple, he condemned many French leaders as agents of counter-revolution. The best solution, he reasoned, was to set himself up as dictator to straighten things out by executing his enemies. Though he was popular, many people from the French provinces believed Marat to be dangerous, eccentric, and mad. Charlotte Corday from Caen was one of those who felt that only Marat's death would end the revolution. Charlotte obtained an interview with him on July 13, 1793, and stabbed him in the chest while he was in the bath. Revolutionary artist Jacques-Louis David used Marat's death as a subject for this painting. It was done as a piece of propaganda to extol the patriotic virtue of the martyred victim Marat. David was also a member of the convention and was put in charge of organizing festivals. On August 10, 1793, the Festival of Unity commemorated the first anniversary of the overthrow of the monarchy. However, David's most elaborate pageant was the Festival of the Supreme Being, held at the Champ de Mars on June 8, 1794. It was held a month after the establishment of a new civic religion based on faith, philosophy, and politics. Some months earlier, a campaign of de-Christianization had taken place against the Catholic Church. Catholicism was associated with counter-revolutionaries. So, under the new system, the Supreme Being was to replace the Christian God. During this period of de-Christianization, robes of the clergy were mockingly used as costumes by the people as they paraded through the streets. Many religious structures were no longer used for religious purposes. The Gothic Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was dedicated to the Supreme Being during the Revolution and then was used as a storehouse for food. Other religious buildings, such as the Cathedral of Saint-Denis, were no longer respected as sacred. Light filters through the windows of the cathedral which was once the royal necropolis of France. During the Revolution, these coffins were emptied and bodies thrown pell-mell into unmarked graves. The elegantly carved tombs were hidden during this period and were later put back in their places. Church property. This large bell at Notre Dame was the only one not removed and melted down to make arms. Perhaps it weighed too much. The peaceful Luxembourg Gardens of today mark the location of over 50 foundries that existed during the Revolution to help in the war effort. With France involved in many battles, it was necessary to produce guns and ammunition to supply revolutionary troops. This clock bears names of months of the new calendar, which was adopted in France during the Revolution. It used different months and years. Year 1 of the Republic began September 22nd, 1792, the day after the monarchy was abolished. Pluvieuse, the rainy month, replaced February. The rainy month replaced February and is represented by this picture, an 18th century version of a calendar girl. Robespierre and the Reign of Terror were finally stopped during Thermidor, the hot month, July 1794. A short time before, Robespierre sent Danton to the guillotine to be executed only because Danton was weary of the bloodshed and wanted to end all the killing. However, Robespierre would not be satisfied until all the evils in society were purged. When other members of the convention wanted to end the violence, they conspired to stop Robespierre in what was called the Thermidorian reaction, named after the new style month in which it fell. In the course of events, Robespierre was shot in the jaw and lay in pain for a few days before facing the guillotine himself. The Thermidorian reaction gave new direction to the government. Religion was once again tolerated, and radical Jacobin political clubs were abolished by force. An ambitious young Corsican officer named Napoleon Bonaparte was building an illustrious military career for himself during the time of the Revolution. Napoleon headed an army detachment that came to the aid of the Thermidorians when royalist conspirators marched on Paris in 1795. He also helped to install a new government known as the Directory, with 5 directors. This new government, however, soon became quite repressive. A shortage of bread caused the people to storm the convention on May 20th, 1795. Feeling insecure, the directors began to hunt down those who had just been released from prison. They also eliminated some personal freedoms which had just been won. During the troubled 4-year period of the Directory, the military branch of government grew more powerful than the civilian. Mainly because of the leadership of Napoleon, military victories over the Austrians in northern Italy allowed France to expand its frontiers. Napoleon led an expedition to Egypt in 1797 in hopes of interrupting England's trade route to India. Victorious on land, but defeated at sea, he returned to France in 1799 after receiving disturbing news of the political situation at home. Abbé Sieyès, one of the directors, decided it would be in the country's best interest to overthrow the Directory and to establish yet another new constitution that combined liberty and stability. He picked Napoleon to help him do this, as he needed the support of the military. Thus, in a coup d'etat on November 9th and 10th, 1799, or 18 Brumaire on the new calendar, Napoleon and Sieyès forced the resignation of the other directors and had themselves appointed provisional consuls. As first consul, Napoleon had almost unlimited power under the new constitution. After 10 years of struggling for a balance of personal liberty and representative democracy, France fell under the control of a popular dictatorship. Eventually, Napoleon became Emperor of France and exercised more absolute power than had Louis XVI. His influence is still felt today in many government institutions. While the French Revolution left unsolved many of the problems which had spawned the popular uprising, it created an awareness of universal human rights that transcends time and place.